Billionaire's wife left his sick son in the mountains. What happened next shocked the police force. A cold-blooded woman abandoned her husband's little son in the wild mountains of Colorado, a boy of 7 years suffering from a rare congenital heart condition that had never been properly treated, believing no one would ever uncover the truth. Yet the moment she turned her back and drove away, the chandeliers in the great hall of the Walker estate continued to cast their warm, golden light. The crystal glasses still chimed in gentle toasts, and the drifting strains of symphonic music floated through the air as if to cloak a secret no one dared to name. In that grand chamber of power and glittering elegance, a small, trembling, and nearly invisible child stood pressed against the cold marble banister, his soft slippers gliding across the polished wood floor. Ethan Walker gripped the railing, his wide eyes fixed on his father, who lifted a glass of whisky among the distinguished guests, and deep within him rose the unmistakable sense that his life had never carried meaning for the people laughing below. That night, after the guests had gone and the lights had dimmed and the house had fallen into stillness, Ethan's frail body convulsed violently on his bed. His breath caught, his eyes rolled back, and his limbs curled tight as a sudden spasm of his fragile heart tore through him. At that moment, his father, Charles, stood motionless in the doorway, his gaze cold as he watched his son wrestle with life and death. No tears, no touch, no words of comfort. And when dawn arrived, the car carrying the boy wound its way through a fog-drenched mountain road and halted in a lonely clearing deep within a forest of pines. Charles said little. He only bent down, looked into Ethan's eyes for the first time in many months, and spoke in a low, steady, and utterly empty voice. "Stay here." Then he rose, closed the door, started the engine, and drove away. The red glow of the taillights faded and slipped behind the trees. Ethan stood there, unable to understand, unable to believe, struggling even to breathe. He took a few steps after the car, but his small feet slid on the brittle layer of dry leaves. He called out, yet the wind carried his voice away. Darkness tightened around him like a damp, cold blanket. The wind hissed through the branches like the whisper of the forest, and the first snow of the season touched his hair like a farewell no one wished to speak. In that frozen darkness, only the faint beat of Ethan's failing heart sounded beside the breath of the wind. He lifted his gaze to the ashen sky where the bare branches reached upward like desperate hands, and he wondered if this was the place where he would die. Yet what happened next would change everything forever. Before we continue with the next chapter of this haunting story, take a moment to subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel, like the video, and share it with someone you feel might also need to be touched by a story that goes deeper than words. Each day we bring you moving, human-centered stories told with care and deep empathy. Where are you listening to this story from? Leave a comment below and let us know which city or state you're in, so we can feel just how far this story is reaching across America and beyond. Now let us return to the tale and uncover what lies beneath the glittering lights and the carefully rehearsed handshakes inside the Walker estate. Ethan Walker had long grown accustomed to being a shadow in the very house where he had been born, and before Madison stepped into his father's life, silence had already been a familiar companion. But after she became Charles's new wife, that silence hardened into invisible walls closing in around him. During the days of the wedding celebration, the Aspen estate overflowed with laughter and bright congratulations. Yet no one asked where Ethan was, or perhaps they knew, and simply chose to avoid the fragile boy with the pale face marked by his heart condition. To the guests, Ethan was nothing more than an inconvenience, a wrinkle on the shining gown Madison wore. To Madison herself, he was a threat to the polished reputation she worked tirelessly to craft, the lingering shadow of the first wife she refused to let anyone mention. To Charles, he seemed like a note scribbled in a notebook, long forgotten, not because he hated his son, but because he had grown too familiar with turning away from whatever exposed his own weakness, and the child with the faint breath reminded him of losses he did not wish to face. Ethan could not remember the last time his father had held him. He remembered only the gentle scent of his mother's perfume, the soft hand on his cheek each night, memories now thin as drifting smoke every time a heart spasm tightened his chest. After her death, Ethan was handed from one caretaker to another, all polite and dutiful, yet none willing to truly look into his eyes. Madison was far worse. She swept into the house like a fierce wind and erased every trace of the woman who came before her, remaking the furniture, the schedule of Charles, even the atmosphere itself. In all these changes, there was only one thing she wished to remove, but had not yet managed to do: Ethan. To her, the boy with the fragile heart was a flaw, an obstruction, a reminder that her carefully crafted family image was not as perfect as she needed the world of society and media to believe. So Ethan was pushed away from every space she occupied. When she directed the staff to arrange the wedding, he was ordered to stay in his room. When her friends visited, the servants were told to send him to the kitchen or the greenhouse. When Charles took her to tour the family ranch, Ethan was left behind with a nanny. And he understood. Children always find their own way to recognize when they are not wanted. For Ethan, it was the way Madison looked through him, as though he were dust waiting to be wiped away. The dinners, where he sat silently at the end of the table, and no one asked whether he had eaten, the moments when his heart seized and he lay still, waiting for the pain to pass, because the adults around him were too afraid to touch him. Yet deep inside, he held on to a hope he could never fully explain. Each night before sleep, he would glance down the stairs, wishing that his father might look up and see him and call his name and ask him to come closer just once. But that gaze never rose to find him. On the night of the wedding, amid the bright clinking of glasses and the cheerful music, Ethan remained tucked behind the railing, as always praying that on this night at least his father would remember he had a son watching him from afar. But in Charles's eyes, there was no trace of him, for he was lost in the flawless world Madison had shaped. In that moment, among glittering lights and grown-up laughter, Ethan understood something no 7-year-old should ever be forced to grasp: that in the Walker family he was little more than a faint existence, a wandering shadow in the house that should have been his home. And as his father's cold distance joined with the contempt in Madison's gaze, everything that followed no longer felt like a sudden disaster, but simply the next step in a tragedy written long before he had the words to name it. Right after the wedding night, when laughter still clung to the stair rails and the scent of flowers lingered in the great hall, Madison quietly decided that the Walker home had room for only one child, and that child would never be Ethan. At dawn, as the first rays of sunlight slipped through the wide glass windows, Charles left Aspen for a meeting in Denver, leaving the vast estate entirely in Madison's hands. She stood before the mirror, adjusting her glimmering earrings, her lips curving into a cold smile Ethan would remember all his life. When she stepped into his room, she did not knock. She saw him curled on the chair near the window, his small legs dangling above the floor, his hand resting on his chest as though to steady the heartbeat that never behaved. Her voice drifted out lightly, as if she were commenting on the weather. "Ethan, today we are going on a little trip." He looked up with wide eyes, carrying both surprise and a small spark of joy. He had not been allowed outside for so long, and the thought of an outing made his fragile heart beat one quick, hopeful rhythm. Madison smiled, though the smile never reached her eyes. She told him to change his clothes, swept a few items into a tiny bag, then took his hand and led him outside. Ethan trembled slightly at her touch, unfamiliar and unsettling, but he did not dare pull away. He told himself this might be his chance to be better, sweeter, easier to love, so she might finally see him as something other than the unwanted piece of this family. The black SUV sped along the winding mountain road leading away from Aspen. Tall pines swept past the windows like silent sentinels guarding the entrance to the forest. Ethan gazed at them in wonder, his small body leaning toward the window as though he might touch the passing world. He asked where they were going and whether his father would meet them there, but Madison answered with a gentleness too soft to be trusted, saying that it was a surprise meant just for him. Her answer made him fall quiet, though it did not stir suspicion. He needed to believe she was trying to draw closer to him. After an hour of driving, Madison turned onto a narrow dirt road leading deeper into a national forest. There were no signs for tourists, no resting areas, none of the familiar paths families used when camping, only old trees and a chill that carried the scent of pine resin. When the car stopped, Madison opened the door and told Ethan to step out. Her voice had taken on a strangely serene tone. "Today is a very important day. We need to talk." Ethan stood on the damp earth, his cloth shoes sinking slightly into the soft layer of decaying leaves. He pulled his jacket tighter as the wind rose sharp and whistling through the branches. Madison walked to the back of the car, opened the trunk, and took out a thin blanket. Ethan thought she might drape it around him, but she simply placed it on a large stone as though preparing a stage for a performance whose script he was the only one not given. She told him to sit. He obeyed. He searched her face, the face his father had chosen for some trace of gentleness or goodwill, but all he found was a cold, decisive stillness in her eyes. Madison sat before him, smoothed her coat, and spoke slowly. "Ethan, you are a good boy, but you do not belong in this family. You make your father worry, you make him tired, and you make everything harder." Ethan did not understand all her words, but he recognized the feeling that rose within him. It was the same tightness that came whenever his heart clenched in pain. He tried to speak, tried to beg her for a chance, promising he would behave better, be quieter, try harder. But she lifted her hand to silence him. "Everything will be easier for everyone if you stay here." The words were delivered so calmly that Ethan needed several seconds to grasp what she had done. When he leapt up to run after her, Madison was already on her feet, already turning away, already walking quickly toward the car. The door shut without hesitation. The engine roared. The vehicle rolled backward, then sped down the narrow path, its wheels scattering brittle leaves. Ethan ran after it, but his small feet could not master the uneven ground. The car vanished around a bend. He stood alone in the vast mountain forest where no human sound remained. In that moment, Ethan understood that Madison had never wanted him to be part of the family, and this was no outing. It was a sentence, and he was the child left behind. The last sound Ethan heard from the world he once belonged to was the crunch of tires grinding over the hard forest floor, growing fainter and fainter, until it dissolved completely into the vast, cold silence. He stood motionless in the clearing carpeted with decaying leaves, his eyes wide as he stared toward the place where the car had vanished. His lips trembling without forming a single word for what was happening, exceeded anything a 7-year-old could imagine. At first he waited, believing Madison was only trying to frighten him, believing she would return after a few minutes, to test whether he knew how to be afraid. He stood there while the wind moved through his hair and pressed his thin shirt against his small frame, and he hunched his shoulders and clutched his coat as if holding on to the last trace of warmth he had carried from the car seat. But each passing minute stretched into something slow and heavy, and little by little he understood. No one was coming back. There was no engine returning, no footsteps, no sweet false voice. Only the wind moving through the ancient pines and the distant call of forest birds reminding him that he was utterly alone. Ethan sat down on the stone where Madison had placed the blanket. He wrapped it around himself, though it was far too thin, and the cold of the mountains was nothing like the cold he knew from behind the windows of the warm estate. There was no fireplace here, no lamps, no steady adult hand to pull him close. Only the fading light of the forest afternoon and the darkness slipping through the branches with slow and certain intent. He drew his knees to his chest and rested his head against them, his heart hammering with worry. A faint pain rose beneath his left ribs, a dull murmur reminding him of the illness he did not understand but had lived with for as long as he could remember. The doctor had once said he must avoid cold, must rest, must be monitored closely. Now he had no doctor, no medicine, no name to call. He began to shiver, not only from the rising wind but from a fear sinking into every inch of his skin. A sudden spasm made him flinch, his hand pressing against the sharp ache in his chest. His breath shortened quick and strained as if even the forest itself refused to give him air. In that moment he wished he could scream, wished that someone, anyone might hear. But he knew there was no one. No kind stranger walking through the woods, no patrol passing by, no miracle. And then night swallowed the clearing until only the faint scattered stars remained above. Ethan lifted his gaze. The stars flickered across the deep black sky like distant eyes watching him without stepping forward and without pity. He didn't cry. There were no tears left. Only shallow breaths, a darkening shade of blue on his lips, and his small hand gripping the edge of the blanket. He tried to stay still to keep his heart from rising beyond its fragile limit. The wind surged louder through the trees. A twig cracked dryly like a footstep. Ethan's eyes flew open as he scanned the darkness, his pulse racing, yet nothing moved except shadows and drifting mist. He didn't know how much time had passed. He could not count it. The cold crept into his fingers until they grew numb, like pieces of himself that no longer belonged to him. His eyelids sagged under the weight of exhaustion, of pain, of fear, and hopelessness. As he drifted near unconsciousness, he no longer wondered whether Madison would return, but whether death itself would hurt. He didn't know if it would come swiftly or slowly. He only knew that if he died here, no one would know his name or the small life he had once lived. And in the final thought before his awareness faded, Ethan whispered silently to himself, a question meant for no one. Was there ever a child in this world who deserved to be left without a farewell in the deep forest, simply because they were not as perfect as the adults wished them to be? On the northern slopes of Colorado, several dozen miles from the national forest, an old timber cabin rested beneath the shelter of ancient pines, and it belonged to Frank Delaney, a man who lived alone with silver-threaded hair and eyes as deep as the cold mountain lakes. Frank had once been a homicide detective in Wyoming, the kind who spent years chasing cases that made headlines. But he had abandoned that noisy world after the sudden winter death of his wife in the 12th year of their retirement. From then on, he withdrew to these mountains and built this cabin with his own hands. Living out his days hunting splitting wood, reading worn books, listening to the radio, and repairing objects that had been broken for far too long. He did not like strangers, and he did not like children. Children were noisy, fragile, and far too often carried questions he did not want to answer. Frank believed the world was no place for innocence, for he had seen too much darkness in his former line of work to believe in tidy endings. That was why when he discovered unusual tracks in the woods the following morning, he never imagined he would find a child. He had set out only to check his traps, but while crossing a shallow basin near the forest edge, he heard a faint sound carried by the wind. A tiny moan easily mistaken for an animal cry. When he moved closer, he saw a small figure curled beneath a layer of dry leaves and a thin blanket soaked through with frost. It was a boy, small, frail, blue-lipped, utterly still. Frank stopped breathing for a moment, instinct honed from years as a detective brought him to his knees beside the child. He touched the wrist, icy cold, yet still holding the faintest thread of a pulse. The boy's lips were pale, his eyelids barely open, his face smudged with forest dust. There was no backpack, no hint of a camping accident, no sign of nearby adults, no fresh tire marks, no discarded belongings. Only an eerie silence and a biting cold. He lifted the boy. Though as light as a fallen branch, Frank could feel the unconscious resistance in that small body, as if the child were fighting something far larger than himself. All the way back to the cabin, Frank said nothing. He laid the boy on the bed near the stove, lit a fire, warmed some water, and wiped the dirt from his face. When Ethan woke, he didn't open his eyes at once. He shivered, coughed softly, then gasped for breath. Frank sat beside him without touching him again. He simply watched. This child was unlike any he had ever encountered. He did not scream, did not call for his mother, did not spill fear into the room. He remained silent. His clouded eyes drifted across the cabin, then stopped on Frank. A second passed, then another. And as if acknowledging the strange fact that he was still alive, Ethan closed his eyes once more. Frank rose, brought another blanket to cover him, then sat in the chair across the room. Questions began to churn inside him. Questions he could not reason away. Who would abandon a child in the forest during the cold months? Why was no one searching? And if the boy survived, what future could possibly await him? Frank had no answers, but he knew one thing with perfect clarity. He could not return the child to the woods. And though he had never once imagined raising a child that night, as the wind screamed against the roof and the fire cracked within the stove, Frank Delaney kept watch over the sleep of a boy whose name he did not yet know, but who had already nudged his long, quiet heart out of its weary rhythm. The next morning, a thin wash of light slipped through the small cabin window and fell across Ethan's still pale face, and though he lay quiet beneath the thick blankets, with his body slowly regaining warmth, his eyes carried a depth of exhaustion no child should know. Frank sat near the stove making coffee in silence, glancing toward the boy now and then, as if waiting for something he could not name. He was not a man skilled in conversation, nor one accustomed to tending to others, and certainly not to children yet. Through the long night, he had watched every fragile breath Ethan took, fearing that if he looked away even for a moment, the child might simply vanish. When Ethan stirred, Frank stepped closer. The boy opened his eyes, looked around, then looked at him with a bewildered expression as though he could not trust the reality before him. Frank bent down and asked his name, asked where he had come from, but Ethan only pressed his lips together without answering. Frank tried again, his voice lower, slower, but the boy remained silent, offering only the smallest shake of his head and averted eyes, as though he himself was unsure whether he still had the right to speak. Frank frowned slightly. He had seen this before during his years as a detective. Children abandoned or shocked or torn from something they could not understand sometimes lost their voices for a while, not from injury, but because the mind sealed itself in a desperate attempt to survive. Yet looking at Ethan, he knew this was not merely a lost child. This was a small soul who had crawled out of a place so dark he had not yet believed in his own survival. Frank did not question him again. He returned to the table, took a slice of toasted bread from a chipped enamel plate, and set it beside the bed. Ethan looked at the bread, then at Frank, still silent, but this time he reached out carefully and lifted it, as if afraid the slightest movement might cause the moment to disappear. Frank went back to his chair without another word. He let the boy eat in quiet. Let him learn that here no one commanded him. No one shouted, no one forced him into anything. Only time and patience lived in this room, and perhaps those were gifts Ethan had never known in the brief years behind him. Over the next 3 days, Frank cared for Ethan the way a man who had lived alone too long relearned what it meant to share his life with another human being. He made simple soup from vegetables and dried meat. He warmed water and helped the boy wash. He handed him an old wool sweater that had belonged to his wife and that he had kept folded in a cedar chest like a memory he rarely dared to touch. And each night, he built the fire higher so the warmth would fill the cabin and wrap itself around the child who still had not spoken a single word. Frank did not ask questions anymore. He told small stories about the forest, about the snow, about the deer that wandered near the cabin. He expected no response. He only wanted Ethan to know that some adults didn't judge silence or punish it. Then, one afternoon, while Frank was stacking wood outside, he returned to find Ethan sitting on a small stool near the stove, trying to coax the embers back to life with a thin stick, imitating the way Frank tended the fire each day. The boy did not look at him or speak, but his hands were steady, intent, and for a brief moment his eyes brightened when the flame rose again. Frank stood still, saying nothing. He only watched, and in that quiet second he understood that something within the child had shifted. No need for words. No need for explanation. That first flame the boy coaxed to life in the small wooden cabin was more than warmth for his hands. It was a sign that he still wished to live, that somewhere inside him a faint ember remained, and perhaps with enough time and enough patience, that ember might grow bright enough to warm the hearts of two people who had grown far too used to living in solitude. Winter in the mountains was never meant for the faint of heart. The wind slipped through the mountain passes like sharpened blades cutting into the skin. Snow swallowed the old trails in a white hush, and every sound seemed to tighten beneath a sky the color of ash. Yet for Frank Delaney, that cold was no longer an enemy. It had become part of his life, a silent companion that taught him patience and discipline. Now, with a small new breath inside his wooden cabin, winter felt different. Perhaps not gentler, but enough to make him keep the fire burning without fail. Ethan still did not speak, but he no longer avoided Frank's gaze. Each morning when Frank rose to tend the fire, Ethan already sat waiting on the chair, his hands wrapped around the metal cup Frank had filled with warm milk the night before. No words were exchanged yet. An unspoken pact formed between them, a quiet understanding that required no language. The boy learned to do small tasks, bringing in firewood, folding blankets, wiping the floorboards, arranging the old books Frank had kept from his working days. Not because he was told to, but because he wanted to belong to this place, even just a little. Colorado did not welcome weakness, but it never punished those who fought to survive. Frank began teaching Ethan the basics of living here, how to split wood along the grain so it burned easily, how to read the signs of wildlife in the snow, how to recognize the sky's warning of an approaching storm. These were lessons with no blackboard and no written rules, only the weathered hands of a man who had endured both time and loss. Ethan listened, remembered, and then tried. At first he fumbled, but Frank never raised his voice. If the boy made a mistake, Frank simply did the task again for him to watch, then placed the tools back in his hands for another attempt. Winter taught Ethan something no one in his earlier life had ever offered, that he was not a burden, that if he tried, if he held on, he could become part of the world, not as an outsider, but as someone who mattered. His heart condition remained a shadow, always waiting. There were nights when the tight aches returned, curling him forward with short breaths and cold sweat soaking the collar of his shirt. Frank always noticed and never asked too many questions. He only added more wood to the fire, administered the herbal remedies he had learned from the indigenous elders, warmed water with honey and sat beside him until the pain receded. No soothing words, no hollow comfort. His presence alone was enough. Once, while teaching Ethan how to stack stones for an outdoor cooking pit, Frank paused, wiped his brow, and looked at the boy. "If you stay here, you will have to learn to live like a Colorado man. No demanding, no complaining, only working and believing." Ethan did not speak, but he nodded. A small, quiet nod, slow, yet certain. To Frank, it was the strongest answer a child could give. Time moved gently in Colorado. There were no schedules, no bells, only the rising sun and the falling snow. Yet, within that steady rhythm, Ethan began to change. His skin took on a healthier color. His steps grew steadier. His eyes no longer hid from the world and seemed to brighten whenever he watched the fire glow in the stove. Colorado did not erase the wounds in his heart, but it taught him how to live beside them. No weeping, no resentment, only the practice of living day by day, breath by breath, as though each moment was a chance to prove he deserved to exist. And in that coldest corner of America, a boy once abandoned began to kindle a fire of his own. In Colorado, where winter stretches on like a quiet test of endurance, Ethan did not just learn how to survive, he learned how to observe in order to live. Frank never taught him through long lectures or hurried instructions. He simply lived the way he always had and allowed the boy to watch, to listen, and to choose his own way forward. Each morning, Frank rose before the sun cleared the mountaintops. He opened the door and sniffed the wind to read the snow. Watched the bird trails to gauge the weather, listened to the forest to tell which animals had passed through the valley during the night. Ethan followed him silent as a shadow. He learned how not to break twigs beneath his feet, how to step lightly on thin snow without making a sound, and most importantly, how to be still. But that silence was no longer the silence of fear. It had become a deeper listening. Ethan began to understand that the forest had a voice of its own, and with enough patience it would speak to him. The first time Frank showed him the faint signs of a deer's passing, Ethan saw nothing but shallow indentations in the snow. But the second time, the third, and by the 10th, he could read the direction of its steps, the weight it carried, even guess whether the animal had a young one following close behind. Whenever he guessed right, Frank said nothing elaborate, offered no applause, just a quiet nod. And to Ethan, that nod meant more than any praise ever had. Frank never treated him like a child. He handed him a small knife to carve wood, taught him how to shape arrow tips, how to set crude traps, how to press his palm to the ground and feel for vibrations when a large animal moved nearby. These lessons were not written in any book, but each detail etched itself into Ethan's memory like marks of survival. Alongside the skills, he slowly learned to feel the world again. He began to see beauty in snowfall, no longer fearing it, as he had that first time he was left alone in the woods. He practiced calming his heart when pain gripped him, breathing slow and deep. He came to understand that not every moment brought rescue. Sometimes you had to keep yourself alive first. Frank never asked about Ethan's past, and Ethan never told it, but with every quiet gesture placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder during a heavy snowfall, breaking in half the last piece of bread on a wind-hardened day. Frank told him all he needed to know. He didn't care who Ethan had been or where he had come from. As long as the boy stayed as long as he tried each day, then he had earned his place here. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt he did not need to beg to exist. He didn't have to charm anyone, didn't need to shrink into corners so he wouldn't bother anyone. Here he could simply be, quiet, persistent, and learning to grow in the stillness of the wilderness. And then on a pale gray afternoon, while Frank sat mending an old coat, and Ethan was carefully wiping down the flint and fire tools, Frank looked up and asked, "Would you like to learn how to use a map?" Ethan looked at him, surprise flickering in his eyes, then nodded. That was a lesson greater than anything he had been taught before. It was how to find your way when you were lost. It was how to know where you stood in the vastness of the world. And in that moment, Ethan understood something clear and quiet. If one day he left this cabin, he would no longer be the boy who had been abandoned in the forest. He would be someone who knew direction, who knew how to see, how to endure. Most of all, he would be someone who had chosen to live even after the world had once turned its back on him. The fourth spring in Colorado came with the soft green of new grass and gentler winds slipping through the mountain passes. But deep within Ethan, something had begun to shift. He was no longer the frail boy curled beneath a thin blanket in the forest, nor the silent child hidden behind his own breath. Now Ethan was 11 years old, taller, stronger, and in his eyes something had changed. Not just memory, but will. One afternoon, as they repaired the porch roof after the last snowstorm of the season, Ethan tightened a rope, then stood still looking at Frank for a long, quiet moment. Frank didn't ask. He knew that moment would come. A man who has lived alone always knows when someone is about to leave. He set his hammer down and sat on the steps, hands resting on his knees, eyes turned toward the trees. Ethan came over, said nothing, and sat beside him as they had on so many other evenings. But this time was different. His chest swelled, his throat dried, and finally the first words in 4 silent years slipped out. "I want to go." His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, clear. Frank didn't look up. He only gave a slow, quiet nod. He didn't ask where or why. He had seen the books Ethan read at night, the old maps of America he spread across the table, the scribbled names of cities where his eyes lingered longest. New York. That name came up more than once. Not because it was the biggest city, but because someone there needed to be faced. There were questions left unanswered. A past Ethan knew he couldn't keep hiding from beneath snow and pine. That evening they ate dinner in silence. Just the clink of spoons against wooden bowls and the soft whisper of wind outside the door. But the next morning, Frank laid a folded sheet of paper on the table. Inside was a new identification card bearing the name Elias Ford. He had prepared it quietly when Ethan turned 10. The new name was for protection, for a new beginning, for cutting the invisible ties that bound the boy to a family that had never claimed him as their own. Frank had never called himself a father, had never spoken like one. But when Ethan stepped onto the bus leaving the smallest town in the mountains, Frank stood there for a long time, raising his hand in a wave so subtle no one else would have noticed. Ethan sat by the window, silent until the trees blurred, until the wooden cabin became no more than a soft memory in the back of his mind. In his bag were a few shirts, a folded map, a worn compass Frank had given him. But more importantly, within him was the stillness of 4 winters, the discipline of the wild, and the name Elias Ford worn like armor. New York was unlike anywhere he had ever known. The streets were crowded, the lights never dimmed, and the air throbbed with 1,000 dreams colliding beneath horns and hurried footsteps. But Ethan wasn't afraid. He stepped into the current of the city as if he had always belonged. With forged documents and the quiet intelligence shaped by years of watching in silence, he earned a scholarship from a nonprofit for children with difficult pasts. Elias Ford quickly became a top student, quiet, focused, exceptionally gifted in strategy and analysis. He never forgot why he was there. Behind every effort he carried the image of a father who had turned away without a word, of a stepmother, whose whispers in the forest still echoed like frost. But this time he was no longer the boy left behind. He had learned how to survive, and one day he would return, not seeking pity, but to ask the questions that only he had the courage to face, because no one can run from the truth forever, not even those with enough power to believe that truth could be buried beneath snow. New York City never sleeps. The skyscrapers reflect light like 1,000 watchful eyes tracking every step taken by dreamers and power brokers alike. In the endless sea of strangers, Elias Ford moved with the cold silence that had become instinct. He was no longer the boy abandoned in the forest. He was now a top student at one of Manhattan's most prestigious academies, handpicked for an elite program in political and economic studies for gifted youth. No one knew he had once lived hidden in the wilderness, and no one guessed that behind his steady gaze lay memories torn open by betrayal. Elias navigated a world filled with legacy names and dynasties built on wealth and influence. He wasn't one of them, but he knew them better than they knew themselves. He studied every file, every partnership, every major transaction. And then one afternoon at an international finance summit in Midtown, a name appeared before him: Charles Walker, his biological father. The man had barely changed in all these years, still the same silver hair neatly combed, the same tailored gray suit, the same camera-ready smile. Only his eyes seemed different, emptier, as if time had carved out whatever light had once lived behind them. Standing beside him was Madison, the woman who had once whispered cold finalities in the forest, now praised as a public philanthropist and founder of a children's education fund. And with them stood a young man, bright-eyed, confident, smiling with the ease of someone who had never been left behind. Aidan Walker, his half-brother, the child who had been loved, raised in warmth and safety, unaware that somewhere out there a brother had existed, a brother whose name was never spoken. Elias watched from the farthest corner of the grand hall, hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, eyes fixed on the three as they walked across the stage to accept the Family Business of the Year award. None of them noticed the stare that followed them, but Elias saw everything. And for the first time, he did not feel the sharp ache in his chest. There was no panic, no breathless rush of memory, only silence, as though his heart had been quiet for so long it had learned to turn to stone. He said nothing. He made no approach. He simply turned and walked out of the room, slow and composed. But from that moment on, every step he took had purpose. He began building connections with senior financial advisors. He joined advanced research groups focused on strategic investment networks. And within 2 years, Elias had become one of the most sought-after young market analysts in New York. He didn't work for wealth. He worked for data, for truth. Quietly, meticulously, he began gathering every document tied to Walker Holdings' high-risk investments, hidden offshore funds, questionable asset transfers during economic downturns. He didn't destroy them, not yet. He waited. And while the powerful continued their rituals, black tie galas, glossy press spreads, hollow toasts to hollow victories, somewhere across the city, a young man was redrawing the shape of their empire, not with threats, not with revenge, but with memory, with precision, and with a patience they could never have imagined a forgotten child would carry. Elias Ford no longer bore the face of Ethan Walker, but he had never forgotten. And he didn't need them to remember, because memory, when strong enough, finds its way back. Not with tears, but with truth. And truth always finds a way to speak, even if it has spent years buried beneath the snow. New York never stops moving, and neither do the people who thrive in its glittering illusions. Aidan Walker was the kind of son every powerful family dreamed of raising, tall, articulate, brilliant, wrapped in a lineage of legacy and polish. He was the child who had been loved, protected, and shaped from the cradle like a billion-dollar investment, rather than a living soul. Piano lessons, European summer camps, elite private schools. Every moment of his life had been curated by Charles and Madison as if he were the crown jewel of a brand rather than a boy. And Aidan had never questioned any of it. To him, family was a portrait perfectly hung, a powerful father, warm yet commanding, a graceful mother tirelessly hosting charity galas for underprivileged children. He was raised on the assurance that he was the best thing that had ever happened to them. He never knew that long before his birth another child had lived in the very same house, a child whose name was absent from every photo on the hallway walls, a child without birthdays, without memories, without a place in anyone's heart, except for a solitary man deep in the woods. Aidan had never heard the name Ethan Walker. He had never been taught the shadows of his family's history. Instead, he was told his mother had struggled for years to have a child, and that his birth had been a miracle, the precious gift destiny had finally allowed. He believed it. He had no reason not to. He was good at sports, charismatic in front of a crowd, admired by peers, and frequently featured in press materials as the bright future of Walker Holdings. On financial news outlets, he was described as the heir apparent, the rising generation of the Walker dynasty poised to inherit a legacy of wealth and control. Elias watched all of it from a distance without envy. He didn't hate Aidan, he only observed. Aidan hadn't left him in the forest. Aidan had simply been chosen kept while Elias had been discarded like a design flaw. He didn't resent Aidan for having what he lacked, but he needed to see him. He needed to understand what had replaced him in the memory of Charles and Madison. And when Elias finally had the chance to meet Aidan at a summit on sustainable development, where both had been invited as panel participants, he knew the moment had arrived. Aidan took the seat beside him, unaware that the quiet young man with the thoughtful eyes was the half-brother he had never known existed. He greeted Elias first, smiling with the effortless charm of someone who had never been taught to fear silence. Elias returned a nod, his reply short, his eyes fixed on Aidan's face. There was something in the voice that made Aidan pause. A distant echo of something unfamiliar yet oddly familiar, something the heart feels before the mind can name. Throughout the session, Aidan shared insights, asked Elias about his research, spoke passionately about justice, responsibility, and doing what was right. And Elias simply listened. He listened to the boy who had grown in sunlight while he had been buried in snow. He listened to the voice of someone who had no idea that the life he lived had come at a cost. When the conference ended, Elias stood and walked away. He left no business card. He revealed nothing. He didn't want Aiden to know, not yet. Because truth, when it arrives at the right time, doesn't need an introduction. It comes like a storm. And it would come for Aiden carrying a single question that would echo louder than any speech he'd ever given. If I had a brother, why did no one ever tell me? And when that question surfaced, the flawless shell of the Walker family would begin to crack. Not because Elias wanted destruction, but because it was time. Time for a family that had lived too long beneath the lights to finally face themselves in the mirror. A mirror they had once left behind in the woods, thinking it could be broken, forgotten. But it had never shattered. It had only waited quiet, fractured, and whole enough to speak. Scandal never arrives with fanfare at first. It seeps quietly like a thin stream of water finding its way through the cracks in stone silent, patient, and inevitable. And for Madison Walker, the woman who had mastered the art of appearing before the public in silk dresses and a smile stitched flawlessly into her face, the first fracture began with a letter, a plain envelope unsigned sent to the editorial office of a respected financial magazine. Inside was a faded photocopy of an old medical document, the paper yellowed at the edges like something rescued from a forgotten drawer. It was a medical file for a child diagnosed with a congenital heart defect treated intermittently at a small private clinic in Colorado over 2 decades ago. The name on the record, Ethan Walker. The legal guardian signed at the bottom, Madison Walker. The editorial staff stared in disbelief. In every public record, Madison Walker had only one child, Aiden, born years after this document was dated. There were no mentions of an Ethan in any family biography, no photos, no birth records, no archived social media posts. Quietly, the magazine began to verify the contents. They tracked down the clinic long since closed, but its files preserved in a cold storage archive. The attending physician had retired, but he remembered that child remembered him well. A silent boy who rarely came with his mother, who always looked afraid. The doctor recalled that Madison never allowed the nurses near him, always in a rush, always distant, never once asking about the results of his tests. The leak to the press was only a matter of time, and when the first headline broke during an evening broadcast, everything began to unravel. The woman once adorned with awards for her philanthropic work with children now stood at the center of a growing storm, accused of being the guardian of a child who had seemingly vanished. The media descended like wolves drawn by blood. They tore through every archived interview, every polished quote, every smile captured on camera. They parsed her early years of marriage to Charles Walker with a scalpel, examining every shadow. Madison remained silent, trying to control the narrative the way she always had. But this time was different, because the force behind it wasn't some political rival or a spiteful reporter. It was the past one she thought she had buried forever. Elias never appeared publicly. He didn't need to. He simply let the right trail fall into the right hands. A medical file slipped to the right newsroom, a quiet nudge in a conversation with an ambitious young journalist. A few financial anomalies revealed in a charity audit tied to Madison's foundation. It was enough. The questions began. If Ethan Walker existed, where was he now? If Madison was once his legal guardian, why were there no records, no photographs, no acknowledgement? And if the boy had died, why was there no obituary, no funeral, no statement of loss? Madison stumbled in a live televised interview. She denied, then evaded, then requested to end the discussion due to personal health concerns. But the camera had already caught it all. Her shaking hands, her flickering eyes, the unraveling composure of a woman who had always been in control. Aiden began to wonder. He started to dig. And for the first time in his life, the pieces didn't fit. Old photos missing from family albums, days when his mother vanished without explanation, the way his father grew tight-lipped whenever anyone mentioned the early years of their marriage. Elias watched it all, every denial, every press release, every new wrinkle etched into Madison's carefully preserved face. He didn't need revenge served loud. He only needed the truth to breathe in the open air. He let the public ask the questions. And more importantly, he let those who once turned away begin to remember a name they had tried to erase. Ethan Walker, a name that now echoed like a crack in the glass facade of the most powerful family in the city. The first break. And not the last. Charles Walker sat alone in his office on the top floor of Walker Holdings, the pale gold glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the unsigned documents strewn before him. Outside, the city pulsed without pause, but inside him, everything felt as if it had begun to freeze. Tonight's news had spoken that name again, Ethan Walker. A name Charles had once buried beneath snow and silence deep in the cold wilderness of Colorado. For years he had never spoken of it, never looked at the papers, never revisited the memories, never allowed even the echo of that name to pass through his mind. As far as he was concerned, everything had ended the day he turned his back and walked away, leaving a fragile boy behind in the trees like a chapter torn from a book best forgotten. But now, as the press reopened old wounds, as Madison faltered under public scrutiny and the questions came louder and faster, Charles could no longer ignore the slow unraveling around him. It began with a conversation Aiden, bright-eyed and earnest, mentioning a young man he'd met at a conference, a boy named Elias Ford. He said the stranger had felt familiar, though he couldn't explain why. Charles had nodded without comment, but inside something twisted. A quiet, cold fear. Then came the broadcast, the footage of Madison's on-air breakdown, her eyes wide with more than just the panic of public pressure. She was afraid, not of rumor, of something real, something coming closer. Late that night, Charles opened the old safe in his private study, hands slower now, heavier. From its depths, he pulled a worn envelope, edges yellowed with time. Inside were the documents he had sealed away: Ethan's birth certificate, medical records, and the hastily signed temporary guardianship form. Madison's name was there. The ink had faded, but the truth remained pressed into the page like a bruise. He had a son. He had left him. He unfolded the only photo he had ever kept, a small boy with wide, hollow eyes and colorless cheeks. Lips drawn tight as if holding in something more vital than breath. A chill coursed down Charles's spine. That stare. It was the same one he had seen weeks ago, just briefly in the crowd at the conference, in Elias Ford. It wasn't doubt anymore. It was certainty, cold and slow, wrapping around his throat layer by layer. He instructed his assistant to pull up everything on Elias Ford. The results came back too clean. No flaws, no missing pieces, no past. And that frightened Charles more than anything. Only someone who had come back from the edge of the world would know how to vanish so completely. Sleep never came that night. In the hour before dawn, Charles stepped into Aiden's room. He stood there for a long time, watching his youngest son sleep peacefully, unaware that somewhere out there he had a brother. Charles placed a hand on his shoulder gently, as if afraid to break something delicate he himself had built too carefully. He sat down in the dark, staring into the quiet, and felt a hollowness rise from somewhere deep within. Years of building an empire, years of applause, titles, and legacy, yet none of it filled the space left by a single decision made long ago. A decision to abandon what he saw then as weakness, what he now understood had been a child, his child. Charles knew it was too late. Whatever he did now, however he tried to explain or bury or repent, Ethan had already grown up, had already returned, had already become a part of the truth that could no longer be denied. He was no longer the sickly, unwanted boy in the woods. He was the man who had stepped out of the dark and rewritten the ending. And Charles, who once believed he controlled the shape of every story, was now only a character in one. A flawed man reduced to memory in a narrative he could no longer dictate. This time he wasn't the one writing the final chapter. A crisp autumn morning unfolded over the winding roads leading back to the mountains of Colorado, where golden leaves danced gently in the breeze and the air carried the faint bite of coming frost. A silver-gray SUV rolled to a stop before the wrought-iron gates of the Walker estate in Aspen, its presence quiet, deliberate. The driver did not open the door. Ethan stepped out on his own hands in the pockets of his coat, his eyes fixed on the mansion that stood still and silent behind a wall of aging pines. 25 years, long enough for memory to blur into shadow. But as Ethan's feet touched the stone path leading to the house, every detail returned with unsettling clarity: the cold that settled in the bones, the smell of damp wood after rain, and the suffocating silence of a place once called home. The front door creaked open after a long pause. The eldest remaining housekeeper, who had once seen him as a ghost from the past, said nothing. She recognized him without needing a name. No one had been warned. No invitation had been sent. Ethan did not enter like a guest. He returned as the missing shape in a portrait someone had tried to paint over. The hallway was just as he remembered. The paintings had changed, but not their places. The staircase stood the same, leading to the second floor, where once as a boy he had clung to the railing and looked down through the banisters at a party below, watching his father raise a glass of whisky, never knowing his child stood above in the shadows. And now that man was there again, Charles Walker. Older, thinner, dressed in a pale gray suit with his tie uneven and his eyes frozen the moment he saw the young man standing at the threshold. For several seconds, nothing was said. No greeting, no questions, just silence thick enough to choke the room. Madison descended the staircase and stopped midway, her face drained of color, her lips parted but unable to speak. Aiden wasn't there. Ethan hadn't asked for him, not yet. This moment belonged to the first two, the ones who had created him, and then cast him aside as if he had never been. Charles was the first to speak. He said only one word. Ethan. No denial, no disbelief. He knew. They both knew. Ethan didn't answer. He walked further inside, slowly taking in each room, as if searching for the remnants of something that had never fully belonged to him. In the center of the grand living room hung a framed family portrait, Charles Madison, a young Aiden beaming with pride. No sign of him. History rewritten, scrubbed clean of its unwanted chapter. He sat down in the large armchair near the window. Sunlight filtering through the heavy curtains falling across his shoulders like a quiet spotlight. His voice when it came was calm, but each word carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. I didn't come back to reclaim a place in that picture, he said. I came to see if the people who watched a child seize in the dark and did nothing are still able to sleep at night. Madison trembled, took a hesitant step forward, then lowered her hand mid-air. She knew he didn't need that touch. Didn't want her apology. Not now. Not after so many years of silence. Charles sat across from him, eyes locked onto the son he had once chosen to forget. Perhaps somewhere deep down he had assumed the boy wouldn't survive. Or if he did, he'd vanish into some corner of the world and never return. But now the man before him had not only survived, he had grown sharp and composed, and had brought with him the one thing Charles had never truly prepared for: truth, the kind that could not be erased with wealth or power. Ethan didn't stay long. He needed nothing from them. No inheritance, no apology, no reconciliation. He came only to show them that the past was not dead. It had simply waited patiently, silently, for the right moment to rise from the cold. And he, the child once left to die, had returned, not to demand, but to prove that the cruelest thing they had ever done had not killed him. He rose and left without a word. No one stopped him. No one followed. Outside, the autumn sun flared bright across the mountains, and the wind moved through the pines like a whisper only he could understand. Justice doesn't always wear robes or sit behind benches. Sometimes it arrives in silence, and all it needs to speak is a memory that never died. The next morning, before the dew had lifted from the cold grass blanketing the grounds of the Aspen estate, Ethan returned not as a ghost of the past, but as a man with a name, a history, and the right to decide how his story would end. Inside the house, Charles and Madison were already seated in the drawing room. Neither had summoned him, but both knew he would come back. They didn't know what they would say, but silence was no longer an option. Ethan took the seat across from them. His gaze was no longer sharp with accusation, but it still left no room for evasion. He didn't come for tears. He didn't come for apologies. He came for truth. And for the first time in 25 years, Charles Walker did not shield himself behind power or poise. He looked his son in the eyes, hands folded as if awaiting judgment. I know you don't need excuses, he said quietly, but you deserve to know. Ethan didn't nod. He gave no reaction at all. That silence pressed Charles to go on. He spoke of the early years after Ethan was born, of the cruel diagnosis of the doctors who could offer no certainty, of the seizures that came without warning, shaking the nights into panic. He admitted to fear, to weakness, to choosing flight over fight. When Madison entered his life, she brought with her the promise of a clean slate, of a life unburdened by shadows, and in his most selfish moment he took it. Madison remained still beside him. She did not protest. She did not attempt to soften the blow. She simply spoke, voice low, hands folded in her lap. That day in the woods, she said, when Ethan turned back and looked through the window, she almost stopped the car. Almost. But she didn't. And that failure, that split-second decision, had haunted her ever since. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. He had lived with the consequences. He had grown up in the silence that followed their choices. He knew what it meant to survive the cold alone, to sleep beside a fire built with your own hands because no one else stayed to keep you warm. But he had not come back to hear their regrets. He had come to end something that had gone on far too long. His voice, when it came, was measured. Every word landed heavy in the stillness of the room. I didn't come here to hurt anyone, he said, and I don't need either of you to suffer to prove that you were wrong. But there is one thing I need. One thing I have never had." He looked at them, both eyes steady clear. "I need to be acknowledged. I need to know that someone in this house remembers that I existed, that you cannot erase me like a line in a story you didn't like. I was here. I lived, and I will not be edited out." Charles nodded. There were no tears in his eyes, but something deeper moved across his face, a kind of collapse that comes when a man finally sees the shape of what he lost. Madison lowered her head. She no longer looked like the polished woman gracing magazine covers, but like a mother who had missed the one chance she'd had to be one. Neither asked for forgiveness. Ethan didn't offer it. Forgiveness is not something you can demand or give for show, but truth once spoken can be the first crack in the ice. And that morning something shifted. Before he rose to leave, Ethan turned back once more. His eyes held no fury now, only the quiet of someone who had learned that justice does not always arrive with punishment, but sometimes with presence. "From now on," he said softly, "we each live with the part of our story we chose. I've chosen to live as Elias Ford, and I will continue as him, not to hide, but because Ethan Walker deserves to rest." No one stopped him as he walked to the door. No one called his name. No one begged him to stay. Only the soft morning light poured in through the wide doorway, casting his shadow long and clear across the floor. A man once abandoned, now walking out of the past under his own power. And behind him, in the house where it all began, two people sat frozen. As if at last they understood the child had never needed their absolution. It was they who needed to learn how to live with the truth. When the door closed behind Ethan, the Walker estate fell into a silence. None of the three left behind dared to break. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be heard had already been spoken, clear and irreversible. There was no returning to the days of curated peace, no rewinding to a version of life where Ethan did not exist. That illusion had shattered. Charles Walker, once the very image of resolve and power, sat alone in his study, his eyes resting on the family photo framed in silver on his desk. He had long believed that whatever was not spoken aloud would eventually disappear. But the truth does not vanish. It waits like a shadow cast beneath light, patient and unrelenting. He remembered every night Ethan had burned with fever, every seizure that left the boy's small body trembling in the arms of a nurse. And he remembered the particular kind of dread that set in when doctors quietly shook their heads, unable to promise a future. He had been afraid, not for Ethan, but of what Ethan represented: a failure, a flaw, a crack in the mirror Charles had tried so hard to keep polished. He had chosen to forget, and in doing so, he had committed the cruelest act a father could. He had walked away. Over the years, he had given Aiden everything he had once withheld from Ethan, but not from love, from guilt, and now he understood with piercing clarity that no child can be used to erase another. No life can be rewritten over a wound left unhealed. Madison's burden was different. She had not buried the truth beneath silence, but beneath denial. Wrapped in silk and accolades, she had told herself Ethan was too fragile, too far gone, that leaving him behind was not cruelty but mercy. She had convinced herself that what she did was necessary. But when she looked into the eyes of the man Ethan had become, she realized there was nowhere left to hide. His gaze had held no hatred, it offered no forgiveness. And that was more devastating than any public condemnation. She shut the door to her room, turned off her phone, and withdrew from the world that had once celebrated her as a patron saint of children. Her image, once pristine, now felt hollow, stripped of meaning. That night she walked the long hallway where family portraits hung in sequence. There was a gap between two frames, a space once occupied by the only photograph of her with Ethan. She had removed it years ago. Now she stood before that empty patch on the wall for a long time. Not to hang it back, just to remember that she was the one who made the absence. And then there was Aiden, the son who had never known he had a brother. The son raised on carefully curated truths, now forced to face a reality that struck like a fist through glass. He searched for the medical files, the fragments of news stories quietly pulled from archives, the names that were never mentioned in public. And each sentence he read felt like a blade carving into the trust he had once placed so easily in the people who raised him. He didn't confront Charles, he didn't question Madison, but he wrote a letter. Not long, Not poetic, just a short note left quietly in Ethan's hotel room, which he located through a detail he caught by chance from an event coordinator. In the letter, Aiden said that if Ethan was still in the city, he hoped to see him. Not to ask for explanations, but to say simply that he now knew, and he would not forget. Each of them, Charles, Madison, and Aiden, carried a weight of guilt that was wholly their own. Charles bore the burden of silence. Madison crumbled under the weight of denial. Aiden began the painful process of growing up with the realization that innocence built on lies still comes at a cost. But in the storm of truth, there is no salvation in excuses, only the courage to stop pretending. And sometimes that courage begins with the hardest truth of all, that you were the reason a child had to learn to survive in the dark. Late autumn in Colorado carries a colder weight than most places. The sky grays earlier here. The wind threads its way through the pine trees, no longer scented with sap, but heavy with the damp breath of snow yet to fall. Ethan returned to the place that once sheltered him from the darkness. Not because he needed to hide, but because he understood only here among the silence and scars did broken things stand a chance of quietly mending. The small wooden house tucked behind a line of aging firs still stood. Its hand-laid roof had long since been replaced, but the weathered porch steps, the same ones where Ethan once spent countless hours in quiet thought, still bore the faint outline of his younger self. He didn't go inside right away. Instead, he walked the land behind the cabin where Frank had once taught him how to split wood, build a fire, and listen to the wind threading through the forest for signs of the coming weather. The wind stung his skin sharp and cold, but Ethan did not flinch. He had grown used to the bite of winter, used to the long silences that stretch out like open roads with no end in sight. Then a voice called out behind him, light and clear, stopping him mid-step. "Are you lost?" He turned to see a young girl with brown hair tied askew, freckles scattered across her cheeks and her face flushed red from the chill. She held a crooked wooden stick like she'd just returned from a little adventure in the woods. Ethan didn't answer right away, just looked at her with a kind of wonder. She asked again, this time with the easy curiosity of children unafraid of silence. "Are you looking for someone?" He lowered his eyes and gave a soft smile. "No, just looking for a way back." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Everyone gets lost the first time they come here. But not me. I never get lost. My name's Chloe." And before he could ask, she stepped closer, studying his face like she was trying to solve a quiet mystery. "I live right over there, with Mr. Frank. Do you know him?" Her words landed like a match struck in the dark. Ethan froze for a breath. A breeze swept through the trees behind them, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the cabin. He nodded slowly. "I used to live here, long before you were born." Chloe tilted her head, thoughtful. "Then you must be the one he talks about. The one who didn't speak at first, but learned how to talk with his eyes." Ethan laughed, surprised by the truth in her words. "That was me." Chloe reached out and tugged gently at his sleeve, pulling him toward the house like they'd known each other for years. "Mr. Frank says people don't have to talk a lot to be understood, but they shouldn't stay quiet forever if they're carrying something sad." She glanced up at him. "Are you carrying something sad?" Ethan walked beside her, the wind brushing through the pine canopy above, creating a low, whispering sound that only the forest knew how to make. He didn't answer right away, but inside him, something stirred, an old, aching thing that felt for the first time in years like it could rest. Chloe led him to the steps where a warm band of firelight spilled across the frozen ground from within the cabin. Frank had aged, his face mapped with deeper lines, but his eyes still held the same sharp steadiness, the calm of a man who had seen too much and learned to live gently with all of it. When he saw Ethan step through the door, he didn't look surprised. He simply set his coffee down, stood, and said with the quiet certainty of someone who had always known this moment would come, "So you finally remembered the way back." Ethan didn't speak. He crossed the room and took the older man's hand in his, holding it tightly, the hand that had once taught him how to survive when there was nothing else to hold on to. Chloe curled into a nearby armchair, flipping open a book, giving the two men the space they didn't ask for but surely needed. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft, sparse flakes drifting from the sky like distant memories returning to rest. Not heavy, not biting, just enough to let someone who had once lost his way know that maybe, just maybe, he had found it again. And Ethan realized then that when Chloe asked if he was lost, she had unknowingly opened the door to something deeper than directions. She had given voice to a question his heart had carried for years. And in that moment, as firelight flickered and the past settled gently into the present, he knew this place did not ask for apologies or proof. It simply asked him to be, to arrive, to sit and be seen. And sometimes that is all a soul ever needs. The next morning, Ethan rose before the sun had fully stretched its light across the vast Colorado sky. The air was thick with mist, and the scent of damp earth and old pine clung to the breeze like a memory that had never left. He slipped on one of Frank's worn wool sweaters, the kind that held the shape of many winters, and stepped out onto the porch with a mug of steaming coffee cradled in his hands and a quiet list of things that could no longer wait. The old wooden gate behind the cabin had long since given in to time. The west fence, shattered in the last late-season storm, leaned like an old man too proud to fall. Frank no longer had the strength to fix these things, and Ethan knew some things cannot wait for later. He gathered hammer nails, planks, and wire and started with the fence. The first stake driven into the cold ground echoed a dry, hollow sound. It didn't welcome him, but it didn't resist either, much like Ethan himself. He said nothing all morning, just worked. His face was set, each strike of the hammer sure and measured, as though every nail anchored not only wood, but some part of himself long splintered. Chloe arrived halfway through carrying 2 slices of toast and a thermos of warm water. She sat on a stone nearby, her eyes fixed on him in silence. Then she asked, "Why are you doing all this?" Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, looked at her for a moment, then answered simply, "So it won't fall down again." She nodded as if the answer was good enough, but her gaze held something older than her years. She didn't ask more. She understood that some answers have to be offered, not extracted. He worked until the sun stood high, soaking through his clothes, with sweat palms blistered and aching. But inside him, there was a stillness he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just mending a fence. He was patching memory, building something new from the bones of something old. Once he believed that to be seen, he had to confront, that only by forcing a reckoning would he reclaim what was stolen. But here, on this quiet stretch of land where no one needed to know his name, he discovered something else worth does not come from recognition, but from what you choose to care for when no one is watching. A simple length of fence standing under the sky had become the thin line between who he had been and who he was learning to become. Frank stepped outside just as Ethan drove in the last nail. He didn't offer praise. He simply nodded, and in his eyes was a trust Ethan had never seen before. "You've changed, not just because of time, but because you've learned to forgive yourself." Ethan sat on the steps catching his breath. Maybe Frank was right. Forgiving others had always seemed hard, but forgiving himself, that had been the true weight he'd carried. For years, anger had been the fuel that kept him moving. But when he finally reached the end of the road, all that remained was emptiness. And now, with dirt under his nails and wood smoke on his sleeves, his heart began to beat to a different rhythm. No more hunger for vengeance, no more need for bowed heads or spoken apologies, just the simple want to keep living on his own terms. That night, the 3 of them sat by the fire. Frank told stories from days long gone. Chloe giggled and leaned against his arm, and Ethan listened. This time, his silence was not a hiding place. It was peace. Outside, snow began to fall, soft as breath, laying itself across the roof of the old cabin. The fence stood quiet in the dark, no longer broken, bearing quiet witness to the truth that sometimes the strongest things are born from what was once left to fall apart. On an October evening, the log cabin, nestled deep in the Colorado woods, was filled with the warm scent of roasted pumpkin pie and simmering soup. The small dining table stood close to the fireplace, where flickering flames cast swaying shadows on the wooden walls. Chloe sat on a high chair, her feet swinging back and forth, her small hands wrapped around a steaming bowl of soup, eyes alight with anticipation as she glanced over at Ethan, who was quietly refilling Frank's glass. Frank, meanwhile, was slicing the pie and speaking in a voice as steady and low as the wind that sweeps through the forest. Back then, he said, there was a boy who got lost in the woods during winter. They said he had been abandoned. He had nothing but a thin coat and a gaze too heavy with silence to put into words. Chloe tilted her head upward. And then what happened? Grandpa Frank glanced at Ethan, a faint smile touching his lips. Then the boy was taken in by a gruff old man. He didn't like children, didn't know the first thing about caring for anyone, but he knew how to work. And he taught that boy how to survive, how to light a fire, split woodset traps, and how to listen to the wind to know when the snow was coming. Chloe blinked slowly, then whispered as if afraid to disturb the moment. Did the boy make it? Ethan, who had been chewing, slowly paused and set his spoon down. Frank looked at him, his aging eyes glimmering with something that might have been pride. Oh, he lived. Not just lived, but grew up stronger than anyone you could imagine. But the most remarkable thing wasn't that he learned how to save himself. It was that once he was strong enough, he went back to the world that had left him behind. Not for revenge, but to show that he had survived. Chloe tilted her head, slightly fell silent for a moment, then asked, "Did he come back?" Frank nodded slowly. He did. After years of wandering, he returned, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because in the end he realized there was one place that didn't ask for explanations, didn't need proof, just wanted him to be himself. And so he came back as an irreplaceable part of this home. Chloe thought for a moment, then placed her spoon down and rested her chin in her hand. "I think I know who that boy is." Ethan let out a soft laugh, his eyes gentling, and his hand came to rest lightly over Chloe's in a quiet gesture of understanding. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall in fine, soft flakes. Inside, no one said another word. They simply ate in silence, listening to the soft crackle of the wood in the stove and the quiet drift of memories in the air. This was no longer a sad story. It was a story of a journey, of a child once left behind who learned to rise, to walk, and to return. Ethan knew that one day Chloe would tell this story to someone else, perhaps to her own child or a stranger passing through. And when that day came, the story would live on, not as a wound, but as proof that everyone deserves a second chance. The small dining table in the corner of the kitchen had now become part of a new memory. No longer cold dinners in the Grand Walker estate, just hot soup, pumpkin pie, and stories told with real love. Ethan was no longer the invisible boy standing by the staircase. He was part of this home, part of a story Chloe would never forget. And in that quiet moment of peace, Ethan realized that maybe he had always needed to hear the simplest question of all. That boy who was left behind, where did he end up? The answer was right here, in the old wooden house in the woods, in the shining eyes of a child, and in the warm silence of a man who once lost everything, but had now finally found himself again. Ethan did not leave the next morning, nor did he say goodbye the way he usually did when passing through. He stayed, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time in his life, he had truly arrived at the place where he belonged. In the quiet cold of the Colorado mountains, in a weathered old cabin with the soft crackle of firewood in the stove, and a young girl whose bright eyes carried questions gentle enough to ease the weight of the past. Ethan felt his heart no longer beat from anger or vengeance, but from the simplest of things. A morning kissed by pale sunlight, a new fence just finished, a nod from Frank that said everything words could not. Calls still came from New York. There were still offers, still contracts that many would dream of. But Ethan no longer needed them to prove his worth. He had come to understand that true success does not lie in how many people know your name, but in being able to look in the mirror each morning and smile at the person looking back. Colorado promised no glory, but here he was given something he had never known in nearly 30 years. The quiet, unshaken freedom to be himself. No pressure, no performance. Chloe still asked hundreds of questions each day, and Ethan had grown used to answering them with a patience he never knew he had. Frank didn't speak much, but each morning when he found Ethan had already lit the fire, he would simply smile quietly as if to say that the one who once lost his way had now found the road home. Ethan's story was not just a tale of survival in the woods. It was the healing of a soul once broken, betrayed, and left behind. This was no fairy tale, and it needed no happy ending. It was a true piece of life where each of us at times might feel lost, but if we dare to face the darkness, we may find the light in a way only we can. And now I want to ask you, the one watching this video, how did this story make you feel? Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Ever been hurt by those who were supposed to protect you? Do you carry a part of Ethan within you? Share your honest thoughts in the comments below. We want to listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. If this story touched something within you, Please like the video and subscribe to Emotional Echoes so you won't miss the deeply moving and meaningful stories we share each day. You can also send this video to someone you care about, so together we can spread messages of healing. Thank you for walking with us through Ethan's long journey. We'll see you again in the next video with a new story, a new emotional path. Until then, we wish you health, peace, and quiet joy every single day. Goodbye for now and take care.